мною принято решение о проведении специальной военной операции.
Once again, Europe has been thrown into the grips of war. Only a week into the conflict, and the situation in the continent is already spiraling into some sort of Dantean hell. As the human toll of this war rises and the violence slowly ratchets up, streams of people fleeing from conflict zones will slowly turn into tides, which will run the risk of overwhelming the neighboring countries and the capabilities of international organizations managing the situation on the ground. Welcome to Bite Size Defense, and today we will look at the current humanitarian crisis unfolding in Europe as countries all around are rushing to provide relief for the growing number of refugees. Every passing day, the Ukraine war persists. The humanitarian crisis it has spawned only gets worse. And yes, it can already be categorized as a crisis. Let's get a scope of the issue facing Europe first. Up until the recording of this video, the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees estimate a total of over 1.5 million refugees have left Ukraine since the 24th of February. That's over 3% of the entire population of the country in just 10 days. UNHCR, in its Regional Refugee Response Plan, expects this number to triple to over 4 million refugees by July, if this war drags on. To put that into context, this is almost half the population of the city of London. On top of this, the latest UN Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs situation reports that there are over 160,000 internally displaced people inside Ukraine. These are people who have fled their homes but remain within the country's borders. Most of these people are either stuck on the various border crossings, train stations, or underneath the major cities that are being shelled by the Russian troops. Experts also worry about Russia's increasing dependence on artillery, cluster ammunition, rockets, and other weapons that can cause huge devastation to civilian areas. All of us by now have seen some of these hair-raising footages of civilian buildings being targeted in major cities like Kharkiv, Kiev, or Mariupol. These tactics will likely lead to greater civilian casualties, infrastructure damage, and in turn lead to more displacement of the population. That's why the European Commissioner for Crisis Management warned that around 18 million Ukrainians can be affected in humanitarian terms, be it in Ukraine proper or in the neighboring countries. One thing that we can be sure of is the fact that as this war drags on, these numbers are only going to rise exponentially. Unfortunately, there seems to be no end in sight for this war, and with Russia escalating the stakes day by day, it can only get worse from here. Even if the most conservative UN estimates of this war come to pass, it will become the largest war-related mass migration since the Balkan Wars of the 1990s. But how have European countries responded to this sudden mass exodus of thousands? Ukraine's neighboring countries have been quick to respond, leading to the biggest show of European mobilization in recent years. As an outside observer, it has been reaffirming to see the reaction to this humanitarian crisis from the immediate neighboring countries. The reaction from Poland, Slovakia, Hungary, Romania, Moldova, and the rest of the European Union countries have been more of a reflex reaction rather than the usual prohibitive and nuanced position that these countries have usually taken regarding refugees in the recent past. Everyone from local volunteer groups, aid organizations, to the national governments of these countries seem to be currently involved in helping these refugees the best they can. Poland, already home to an estimated 1.5 million Ukrainians before the war, has welcomed more than half of all new refugees so far, more than 800,000 in number. The country is reportedly preparing to take in as many as 1 million people and has moved fast in setting up temporary housing, hospitals, and reception centers that offer food, information, and medical supplies at various border crossing cities. Cities like Przemysl have emerged as a principal focus of this ongoing exodus because it is the first major city to the west of Medyka, the busiest crossing point along the 300-mile Polish-Ukrainian border. The refugee camp there offers tents to spend the night, free food, diapers, medical care, and other goods and services, including SIM cards for cell phones. The effort is part of a huge and rapidly organized welcome for these new refugees. Others have found their way into Hungary, around 160,000 people. Moldova and Slovakia have also admitted around 100,000 each so far, and 70,000 have ended up in Romania. Around 4%, which is 50,000, have headed east to Russia as well. Finally, the last 10% so far have also managed to get to other European countries through the immediate neighbors of Ukraine. Since the Ukrainian government has mobilized all men between the ages of 8 to 60, most of these refugees are women and children. Volunteers and officials have worked out an elaborate system to ensure that these refugees are able to connect with their relatives, friends, or with families who are willing to put them up. All in all, despite some mishandling that is likely to occur in such a rapidly changing and fluid situation among most of the Ukrainian border, Europe's response can only be described as swift and paradigm shifting. Germany announced it will relax its asylum-seeking rules for Ukrainian refugees. Ireland announced the waiving of all visa requirements for Ukrainians seeking refuge there, while the Czech Republic lifted its entry ban and COVID-19 restrictions for incoming refugees. Despite a few incidents of racism and violence, especially against African and Indian subcontinent migrants living and working in Ukraine along the various border crossings, the overall atmosphere has been that of solidarity and outpouring of empathy. But as with any humanitarian crisis over human history, the question still hangs: how long will this last? As the war ramps up and the numbers grow, these countries will soon realize that there are millions of peoples who no longer have homes to return to and are being left behind in these refugee camps. How Europe and the larger world responds to that situation will be the real test. But until that time comes, it is the responsibility of various international organizations to aid these countries in successfully mitigating this humanitarian crisis that is unfolding in front of them. The United Nations departments are the biggest player in that regard, in collaboration with hundreds of agency partners, NGOs, private organizations, and other stakeholders. The UN Secretary General swiftly appointed a crisis coordinator for Ukraine to lead the UN response and also announced an immediate release of $20 million in aid from the UN Central Emergency Response Fund. The UNHCR and partners have emergency teams on the ground and are assisting the authorities by providing technical support, carrying out and expanding regular protection, monitoring, and strengthening reception capacity, as well as ensuring that basic and urgent needs are met. These urgent needs include strengthening and supporting access to mental health and psychological support, provision of basic and domestic items including food, unrestricted cash access, and core relief items. Then there are the provisions of WASH, which is water, sanitation and hygiene, education, health service, including sexual and reproductive health services. On top of this, the freezing winter temperatures also mean that emergency shelter assistance and items such as heaters, warm clothes and shoes are also a high priority. They are also carrying out protection interventions that include identifying the most vulnerable refugees, in particular survivors of violence, unaccompanied and separated children, older people, single women and female-headed households. They will be supported through one-stop shop information and referral centers. These centers will offer protection, case management, assistance, and referrals to key services such as legal aid, family reunification, and alternative care services. It is also a fact that in humanitarian crisis, displaced women and girls may be at high risk of gender-based violence and sexual exploitation or abuse, or even intimate partner violence. PSEA protocols, which is protection from sexual exploitation and abuse, will be prioritized by strengthening interagency networks and PSEA mechanisms and systems in receiving countries. But all this coordination and effort takes time, money, and cooperation to carry out. All in all, the various UN refugee agencies are collectively seeking to raise a staggering $1.7 billion for humanitarian assistance from partner countries and private donations to aid with the immediate fallout of this war. Many of us are not in a direct position to help out, even if we want to. So, if you would like to help out in the humanitarian efforts, I have included the relevant links in the description for you. I would encourage you to go through them and educate yourself on the various ways you can make your contribution to help alleviate the misery of millions of these refugees who suddenly find themselves in a terrifying new reality. I am hoping that in the coming days, compassion is able to pierce through the belligerence of war and both parties reach an agreement on a ceasefire to establish humanitarian corridors and evacuate the civilian population so that relief can be provided to millions trapped or on the move. In the meantime, all of our collective thoughts are with the people of Ukraine. Thank you for watching.